Okay, well, let's get started. If people keep joining, they can hop on then. So hello, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Leanne Herchebes, and I'll be the moderator of today's webinar. So first of all, thank you everybody for attending our webinar. Today, actually, you'll get some real life advice from law practitioners that are experts in the field of data protection law and their methodologies on how to best ensure compliance. You'll also hear and see how Interfacing's pre-built GDPR framework helps organizations manage and speed up their GDPR compliance. You'll also hear that while GDPR is a European regulation, you'll see that this webinar is relevant for all corporations around the globe that are processing EU citizen data. Let me introduce our speakers today. There's Thomas, managing partner of the Rickert law firm based in Bonn, Germany. Their firm specializes in legal issues of the digital economy. As well, you'll hear from Jan Lutterbach, who is the head of their privacy team at Rickert law firm. Both Jan and Thomas are serving as external data protection officers for several companies, including international organizations. And finally, you'll hear from Mirko Thomas, who is overseeing Interfacing's European operations. He has many years of practical experience in implementing EPC solutions in large corporations, and he will be demonstrating the GDPR framework with all its operational prerequisites for GDPR compliance. So before I pass it over to the team, at the end of the webinar, we're going to have a Q&A session, so please feel free to post your questions in the web chat, and we'll answer them then. So thank you, and please, Mirko, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome to the webinar. Glad to have you around. So today's topic is GDPR, and actually, I'm going to switch on my camera so that you can see me. So our topic today is GDPR, and at Interfacing, together with our partners Rickert Law firm, we have developed a GDPR advisory services, which enables you to leverage our technologies and immediately implement GDPR processes and governance structures in your organization. Obviously, you therefore can gain control over the operational implementation and monitoring of the GDPR requirements. Now, what I would specifically point out today is that an integral part of our GDPR offerings is the legal advice provided by my co-speakers, Thomas and Jan, and their colleagues. Their vast expertise has already flown into our GDPR framework and into the content, which we will, during this webinar, give you an insight to. And so the technologies from us, plus the legal soundproofing from Rickert Law Firm, make the operational prerequisites for GDPR compliance fully available to you. When I say prerequisites, I mean, most of you are already familiar with EPC. So prerequisites means ready-made processes, a library of roles, of required roles and responsibilities, governance workflows, regulatory business rules, documents, templates, required controls, and so on. It's actually a quite comprehensive framework that is available to you. Actually, this goes as far as we can provide you with a pre-configured solution with all relevant content necessary. Okay, so I'm handing now over to Thomas Rickert and to Jan Lutterbach, who will brief you from a GRC point of view on some key topics of how to become GDPR compliant and on the road to there, where the typical pitfalls are to be found. All right, so Thomas, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mirko, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, to all of you. I would just like to briefly answer the question for you whether GDPR is for you or not. This is a European regulation. It is certainly applicable to all companies, may they be controllers or processors in Europe. But in the advent of the GDPR, a lot of companies that we work with abroad said, well, we're so lucky, this regulation is terrible, but we don't really have to deal with it. Nothing could be further from the truth. At least for those companies that are processing personal data of European citizens or that are monitoring their behavior. And for that, it would be sufficient to, for example, log their IP addresses when they visit their websites. So if you are either as a controller or processor, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what that means, if you're based outside the EU, but if you're offering goods and services to European citizens, or if you employ European staff, then actually you have to worry about the GDPR and its requirements. You have to make sure that you are GDPR compliant. And as you may have heard from the press, GDPR has some severe sanctions. So for major breaches, the sanctions are up to 20 million euros or 4% of the global annual turnover for group companies. And for minor breaches, it would be up to 10 million euros or 2% of the global annual turnover. And you might say, I'm not in Europe, and therefore they can't really reach me. But actually, you usually have to appoint a GDPR representative based in one of the European member states where at least one of the data subjects is based, whose data you're processing. And then this representative can be approached by the authorities or by aggrieved data subjects for corresponding. And you might say, okay, I might not want to do that, but that's what already constitutes a minor breach of the GDPR worth, as I mentioned before, 10 million euros or 2% of the global annual turnover. So in essence, this is something that you should really check. There are some exemptions, but you should test or have tested whether you have to be GDPR compliant, and we're standing by to help you with your compliance process. And particularly for companies that are operating at the global level, you have group companies that are performing different roles vis-a-vis their customers, but also for other parts of the company group. And Jan, my colleague, will now talk you through a couple of real-life examples where companies having issues and what potential solutions could be. So I will speak to you a little bit later during this webinar, but for the moment, let me pass it on to Jan.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, let's assume, as we've heard now, that GDPR applies to you. You will certainly know that GDPR has a lot of different challenges and different requirements. And if you look at that, you will have to figure out what's my role in this. When I'm processing data, what requirements are actually applicable to me, and what do I have to do now? And one of the first steps and actually main differentiations you have to make and is what role is it that I have. So there are mainly three different roles, which are the controller, the processor, and the joint controller when it comes to processing of personal data. The controller is the main anchor for GDPR requirements, as he is the party that determines the purposes of means of processing, which means that this is the entity that defines why data is actually collected and what purpose the data will be processed for. This, for example, to make it more understandable, is if you collect the HR data of your employees as an employing company, this will very much likely be the case that you're a controller for that data, because you decide what data you actually are obtaining and what you're going to do with the data, and therefore you are the controller for it. A second role that you could also have is this of the processor, which is a role where you only process data based on the instructions of another party. Therefore, you're not as free to determine what to do with the data, but merely you receive data with certain instructions what to do with it. You process the data accordingly, but you have no freedom to do anything else with this data. This, for example, is the typical use case would be a software as a service or cloud-based software solution where you receive data of a third party that is actually the controller of this data, and only process the data according to the contracts that you have with the controller and according to this instructions that you received. A third possible situation would be that you have a joint controller relationship where you have not only one controlling entity, but you have several entities or two or more controllers that jointly determine the purposes and means. And this is particularly relevant in situations where you have a group structure of companies, where you have, for example, a centralized department structure where you have processing done by one part or one department for several entities, or where you have several department employees scattered among more entities than one. There you would have a joint controller situation, and this is probably very important from several factors, because this determines what requirements you have to obey to, and it furthermore also has influence on the legal framework that is required. And in our day-to-day work, we have encountered a certain misunderstanding in companies and company groups in particular, where they assume that if you are in one company group, that any transfer of data between entities in one group is justified as if it wouldn't be transferred to any outside of a company. However, GDPR does not have any privilege for company groups. It is to be handled. If you transfer data from one company in a group into another company in the group, it is to be handled as if you would transfer it to any third party. And this is so every transfer in a company group must be justified as if it was any transfer to any third party. And this has to be really kept in mind. And as I've said before, the different roles that you can have also come into play when it comes to the legal framework that you're required to have. There are mainly two different agreements or arrangements that you can have. If you have a data processing situation where one party is the controller and the other party is only acting as a processor based on the instructions, you would need to have a data processing agreement in place whereby the processor guarantees certain safeties and safeguards regarding the data that he handles for the controller. If you, however, come to the conclusion that you are in a joint controller situation, you would have to have a joint controller arrangement in place, which determines the responsibilities between the different parties in the company group, in particular with regards to information obligations, documentation obligations, and which is also very important, the data subject's rights, because as you will know, a data subject has several rights that he can issue, and you will have to have a very good understanding of who is actually responsible for incoming requests by data subjects to be able to comply with the requirements regarding GDPR compliance in that regard. So therefore, it's very important to know who and what role you actually have. And furthermore, another potential issue or challenge you have if you are in a global structure of companies is a transfer of personal data outside of the European Union, because this again requires another justification. Additionally to the justification itself, you will also need to justify the transfer outside of the EU, which can be done by several different means, but I would just like to point out 3 different possibilities. There you have the standard contractual clauses, which have been issued by the European Commission and is a set of predefined legal provisions that should not be changed in any means, which can help you transfer data outside of the EU. Another part would be binding corporate rules, which is a set of rules that you can set for yourself. It's kind of a self-certification or code of conduct regarding processing of personal data, but this has to be approved by the European Commission before you can actually use it as a justification for the transfer. And then as a third part, there would be Privacy Shield, which is also a self-certification which applies to the US. Where you also have to comply with certain sets of rules regarding auditing and how you handle the data when it is actually transferred to the US. Those are some of the possibilities that you can use. And in our daily practice, we have encountered another very, very important and very challenging issue, which is the data deletion and data retention. It is today we often encounter situations where clients tell us that it's for them very, very difficult to comply with the data erasure requirements because the data is not structured in a way that they can easily determine what data has to be deleted after 3 years, what data types have to be deleted after 10 years, and everything's a bit scattered and mingled around. So therefore, it is very important for a controller who is responsible for the deletion of data in a compliant way to understand better where the data is and for what purposes the data is actually collected and still retained. And what absolutely would help there is a well-structured data management system whereby you can identify every data set and where it is currently located in your business, in particular in group companies where the data may be scattered around different companies. And I think Mirko is now going to show you something that might actually help you with this document management.
Jan, Jan, thank you. Yep, indeed. So we will do a little live demo now. Looking at, I mean, most of you are already familiar with EPC, so what you're gonna see now might look a bit familiar to you. Sorry, let me just switch to the right window. Here we go. So when we talk about data erasure, for most of you, that is for most of you or your customers, this is a typical nightmare topic because data of a given data subject is spread over many systems, and for all these systems, it's sometimes not clear who is managing that, where is it located, who can update, who can make changes, and so on. So that's really important. So that's why it is really important to have a data catalog in place. So let me show you how that looks like. Actually, before I show you how such a data catalog can look like in EPC, I would like to start off by showing you a report that I'm going to generate from this given EPC data. So I think that we should do this. In English. And let me. So I'm generating this report live. So everything what you see here happens live, right? So this is a small but typical data catalog or data dictionary. So we have different assets, meaning different systems. In this case, a system called Maximo, Salesforce, and SAP. And inside these systems, so-called entities are living. This is a real-life an anonymized but real-life example from an electricity company and from their smart meter management system. So that's when you look at the names of the entities, that then sounds more familiar to you: meter, reading, customer, bill, the rate, and so on. So first of all, the data catalog provides you an overview of your entities. And for each entity, like, I don't know, let's say in SAP, like bill, you can look up the so-called attributes of this entity bill. It's an attribute called billing date, billing due date, bill ID, and so on. Now let's say build a bridge over to EPC. When I select one of these entities, for example, reading, I can drill down, and again, now we are generating a live view, and will be launched in a second, hopefully. Here we go, it's loading. All right, so here is our entity, reading. For this entity, we have a clear RASI matrix, meaning roles and responsibilities in place. Again, this is managed in EPC, this data. Same here, a CRUD, change, read, update, delete roles. So it is already clear when you want to delete data, who are the roles that you have to address. Then we in EPC, we manage the asset relationships. So here is, again, the blue dot is our entity in question, the reading. And it has, in this case, it has 5 associations with assets. Like with Maximo, with an MDM repository, and so on. And again, for each one of these assets, we can yet again bring up a RASI matrix so that it is clear, you know, what are the responsibilities of these relations. And what I also would like to highlight is that we can also identify here the touch points with the processes in EPC. So we have in this case, there are this entity reading has touch points with 3 process sets, with account management, with ops and engineering, and with finance. And for each one of these processes, I can drill down, and once again get down here. I can identify what is the CRUD matrix for this process set. And so this only gives you a quick idea already of you know, how a data catalog can help you in basically any kind of compliance management situation, but particularly here we are talking about GDPR and the question that Jan has raised: if I need to delete, for example, a customer record, what are the assets, what are the processes, and so on that I have to look at. So just to give you, and that's the last step in this part of the presentation, so just to give you an idea how the very same data looks in EPC. So we are, for those of you who are familiar, we are in the master data module or the master data library. There is the data catalog that this report was built on. Here you have again the entities and the corresponding attributes, and probably as a last step, let me probably drill down here. Here you can really, from the entity bill, you can drill down into the attributes and further drill down, as you know, really as let's say as deep as it is required. Right. So that was a quick excursion on data catalogs and how they can help you with GDPR compliance. If you are interested in learning more about all these aspects of data catalog, please don't hesitate to get back to us on this. I'm now handing back over to Thomas because now we will take a closer look at how our GDPR framework can support you. In particular, we will be looking at one of many specific processes that we have built for you, GDPR-related processes. And this process, the topic of this process is, what are you supposed to do when a data breach is being reported? Before we show you the process and go into detail, Thomas will give you a quick briefing of the legal background this question of handling of a data breach situation. Thomas?
Thanks very much, Mirko. And as you've seen from the title of this webinar, this is not to educate you or to provide information on all aspects of GDPR. That would be far too big of a task, but we're actually looking at some selected issues, and data breaches or security incidents are actually one of the main concerns for companies. And these days, you know, a lot of major and minor breaches occur, and it's likely more suspicious to the data protection authorities if you have not yet reported a breach, because then you know, you might have had some, but you may not have fulfilled your reporting duties. So what we're going to do in the next couple of minutes is look at the language of the GDPR. What does GDPR say about your duties when it comes to a breach? And we're just going to look at Article 33, which I've put on the slide and that you see on your screen, to look at what the law says. And then the big question for you will be, as it was for me when I started looking at these things, how to operationalize this, because you have so many persons, so many individuals, so many technical systems involved that it's difficult to find your way around fulfilling the notification duty. The process that we're going to show you in a moment will deal not only with Article 33, but also with Article 34, which is about the notification of the data subject whose data has been compromised. But this is just to show you the difference between what the law says and what we did in order to operationalize this based on the interfacing system. So I'm just going to read this out for you. It's only going to take a minute. In the case of a personal data breach, the controller shall, without undue delay and where feasible, not later than 72 hours after having become aware of it, notify the personal data breach to the supervisory authority competent in accordance with Article 55. You might ask yourself, what is Article 55? But actually in the EPC, you'll find all these provisions linked, and there's a repository of policies that are applicable to you, unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. Where the notification to the supervisory authority is not made within 72 hours, it shall be accompanied by reasons for the delay. So if you fail to be compliant with this in case of an incident, that is actually one of the major breaches worth up to 20 million euros or 4% of the annual turnover of your company or group of companies. So, you know, you should better take this seriously and be prepared if something happens to take the right steps to notify the authorities and the data subjects in time as needed. We're now going to take a look at the system itself, where we have built the process, and Mirko will give you a little bit of background on what some of the symbols that you will see mean and how the system works before I'm going to shed some light on the legal side of things.
All right. Thank you, Thomas. So let me go back to EPC. So first of all, a quick overview. When we say GDPR framework, what does it comprise? What content is available to you? So first of all, it's all, let's say, all the processes which are required. GDPR is organized along chapters and articles. So here, for example, let's say for chapters number 3 and 4, we have the corresponding processes are already modeled for you. Also, for example, we have already defined the required controls, and such as these, and these controls are also, where applicable. For example, Thomas has mentioned this 72-hour clock. So it means somewhere we have to, to monitor this. So this is also defined in so-called control indicators. We have for you, for example, that regulations are managed in the rule module. So obviously here, all the complete GDPR regulatory library is built here for you, is pre-built. and each article again is subdivided in paragraphs. And for example, when I drill down to this paragraph, here you have the corresponding regulatory text. Okay, so in a moment we will examine one of the processes in detail. But the question which comes up quite often is it in what way is it possible to automate a process like this? So, for example, this is the actual data breach reporting process. It starts off with a notification of a data breach. For example, in this case from the GDPR representative, but there could be many triggers. So first step is to report the data breach to the role called DPO, Data Protection Officer, and this DPO then has to mobilize a response team. So let's take these 2 or 3 initial steps to show you how they would look like when you would automate them. Now I have switched to our digital business platform, you know, low-code rapid application development. This is the form that could be used to report the data breach. Keep in mind what you see here is just, let's say, a generic design. So it means everything that you see here is totally customizable for you or your customers. And that is obviously one of the big advantages of low-code rapid application development. So let me quickly show you again what automation means. So first of all, obviously, I have to capture data. Let's say that this is reported by a customer service. The data breach is reported by customer service. So most likely the data subject would be a customer. The customer data would be pulled from a system like SAP or your CRM system. In this case, I've just put here a generic, I'm putting here a generic placeholder. Then here are the fields that you are required to fill in. And keep in mind, together with our legal advisor from Thomas Rickert's team, we have made sure that this is all fully, what you see here, this form is fully compliant and is fully representing the requirements from GDPR. I'm cutting, if you don't mind, I'm cutting this short, so I will only fill some of the fields for you, and so that you get an idea. And then I'm submitting the form, and now that was the first step. So now the automated workflow kicks in place. So for the sake of easiness, I'm fulfilling here the role both of the data protection officer and of the next role which will come into play, which is the head of IT. So the DPO now has a new pending task in his inbox, which is called mobilized response team. Remember the process. So we have filled the form, meaning we have reported the data breach. Now next is to mobilize the response team. So I'm the DPO, I'm opening this, I'm reviewing the information, and then I decide, okay, for the response team, we need the CTO to be in the team, and we also need the HR manager, for example. I submit the form. And now let's pretend that the next in the workflow would be the head of IT. So he is now supposed to investigate the system where the data breach has happened, and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have more time at this point to really play more to this workflow. Here again, please get back to us after the webinar if you want to learn more of how such processes are automated, and on how we can give you more background and more detail on our automation platform. All right, now as promised, Thomas will now talk you through this data breach reporting process, which is probably one of the key processes of all the GDPR regulations. So back to you, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Mirko. And let's start at the left-hand side of the screen. The worst thing that can happen to you as a company is that a breach is brought to your attention, but the individual that gets the information doesn't pass it on appropriately. And therefore, we have collected all the entry points for notifications about data breaches and have provided this catalog here. Your specific setup as an organization might require us to amend that, but a breach notification can come in through customer support, for example. So your support team needs to be trained adequately, and we can have a control in there to make sure that the training is provided to support staff and that they get a refresher of that every now and then. It is possible that the breach notification comes from a data protection authority, that you get it via snail mail, that somebody calls you, that you get it through your GDPR representative. And all these options are basically embedded into this process. Also, you know, once you've received the information about the breach, we need to make sure that somebody starts the 72-hour clock. And let's not forget, the 72 hours is the time frame. It's a maximum within which you should notify the authorities. So you have to take care of this without undue delay, and therefore it's important to act rapidly, but also pull the right button or push the right buttons in order to get to make sure that you adequately handle the situation. So the clock is started, and then depending on your organization, you might have a data protection coordinator, or you might have an internal or external data protection officer. So we need to make sure that this is being brought to the attention of the data protection officer, if that exists. So let's just assume you have a data protection officer, and that data protection officer receives information about the breach. Then the data protection officer will ensure to obtain some information that's crucial for fully investigating the report. And we have created a catalog of things that need to be asked for. We're not going to read through all of that, but this is just to illustrate what's behind this nice visual animation. The next step that needs to be taken is that the data protection officer needs to make sure that all the relevant people are being brought to the table. So the head of IT will likely need to be at the table. In certain cases, communications people need to be at the table to ensure that crisis communication is taken care of. We might need the legal team to make an assessment whether there's just dust or smoke or there's real fire. And there are some other roles that might need to be involved. And this catalog is just exemplifying who might need to be involved. Then the next step would be to investigate and verify the alleged incidents, because it may well be that the person was approaching the wrong company, that actually in your organization nothing went wrong, but that needs to be found out. So the alleged incident needs to be investigated and verified. And if there is a verified incident, then you need to ensure that the breach stops. So let's say that your network is infiltrated. You need to make sure that the possibility for the perpetrator to access your network is stopped. So that might require you to disconnect certain machines from the World Wide Web. Also, it may well be that data is altered or that data is exfiltrated. It may well be that malicious code is being infiltrated into your network. So you need to make sure that you take the right steps based on the nature of the incident, but you have to make sure that the incident stops, that no further impact on personal data occurs. Once that is done as an interim measure, you need to establish the scale of the problem and the risk level. What do I mean by that? It is a big issue whether you have just accidentally addressed an email to a person that shouldn't get it, and the email doesn't really contain sensitive information. You know, that might still constitute a breach, but that is completely different from you being a health organization or a hospital and health information about your patients has been publicized or modified so that they're at the risk of getting wrong medication or being treated for a different illness than they actually have. So we need to find out what actually happened what the severity of the issues is, and that might require you to involve yet more parties. So you might need to have IT forensics involved to see whether data that may have been exfiltrated from your systems is offered in the dark web. You know, people are trading information that may have been stolen from you, you know, and they can potentially take measures to ensure that no further abuse of the data occurs. So that's something that needs to be done as well. Then as a next step, you need to draw some conclusions. You know, you need to make sure that you respond to the threat that you have witnessed or that you have experienced, and that you take remedial actions. And those may be organizational, those may be technical. So you might need to take a look at your IT security, both physical security. You know, you might need to make sure that certain individuals can't access your data center, or you may need to make sure that certain people don't have the rights to access certain data in your databases, because in many cases breaches don't occur by based on threats from third parties, but it may be your own staff that's making a mistake, deleting data they shouldn't be deleting, altering data they shouldn't be altering, passing on data to those that shouldn't get the data, and so on and so forth. And as you may remember, when filing a report to the authorities, you also need to tell them what you did in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So now we're at a crucial point of this journey, because you need to make a determination with your legal experts, with the technical experts, whether a notification to the individuals is required, and that is what you see at the upper side of the screen. And it may well be that you need to notify each and every individual whose data has been compromised, but it may also be that there is a minor breach where it is sufficient, for example, for you to publicize something on your website to inform the general public, including your customers, about what happened. You know, so that is something that needs to be determined at this inflection point at the upper side of the screen. So either individual information or collective information of data subjects. Now, what you find here is actually taking us to the second line of action, and that is the information of the authority. And what Mirko just showed you is a great example of data forms that are actually being embedded into this process, because the data protection authorities do have notification forms that need to be populated in order to issue a breach notice, in order to make this notification. We're not going to go through this, but this just to let you know that it is all there, and it will be updated if and when necessary, i.e. if either the legal environment changes or case law requires us to alter the process or the forms. Now, when it comes to notifying the authority, you need to find out who do I need to notify? What are the authorities that are competent at the member state level or even at the federal level? So we will have, you know, if you look at this, you will find that that there's a repository of the data protection authorities in there, because you need to notify those data protection authorities that are responsible for the jurisdiction where the aggrieved data subjects are based. Now, then there's another determination that needs to be made, and that is whether you already have a complete picture of what happened, i.e. can you actually do a full report within 72 hours? And if so, then you send the comprehensive note to the authorities. Where that is not possible, and I can assure you that this is the case in many cases where, let's say, IT forensics still need to find out whose data, you know, if you have millions of customer data sets in your system, you need to find out what data exactly has been exfiltrated and what jurisdiction are those individuals whose data has been compromised. And then you might need to only issue an initial notification to stay within the 72-hour time frame, and then after you've done that, send a follow-up notification, which you find a little bit later on in the process. After that, you need to monitor what feedback you get. It may well be that the authorities say, thanks for letting us know, but we will take no further action. It may well be that the data subjects don't respond, or they say, okay, it's fine, I'm not going to escalate this. but it may also be that the authorities get back to you and say, well, this is something that we really need to take a look at, that they further audit you, and that you're at the risk of being sanctioned for what happened. So we might need to take additional steps, and that is either implementing recommendations or orders that you get from the authorities. We might need to talk to financials to put aside financial reserves to cover sanctions from the authorities or potential damages that you might suffer from aggrieved data subjects. So you might need to execute follow-up action. And then ultimately, when you've taken the remedial action, when you have done your correspondence with the data subjects and with the authorities, then this case ends. And before I yield the microphone, I should say that, within this process, we've also embedded a couple of controls, so you can be sure that those who are involved in making sure that compliance is abided by, that they actually do what they're supposed to do, and that somebody keeps the time, and that you have some options for analysis and improvement inside your organization. So with that, I'd like to pass it back over to Mirko. Thank you.
All right. So that concludes the live demo part of this process, and I think now we are ready to actually let you speak and let you come up with questions. Leanne, would you be so kind to introduce us to the Q&A session?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I definitely will. Okay, right now is our Q&A session. I know you've received a lot of information. We have a few questions here for you. Maybe we can start here. I'll start with this one that a few people have asked the same question in different ways, but here, what is your onboarding process? I'm assuming this could go back to both you, Mirko, and Thomas. So what is your onboarding process of your platform or your methodologies? Mirko?
Yeah, okay. I was fiddling with the unmute. All right.
And Thomas, I think, was going to answer this too.
Yeah. Well, so I think both Thomas and I could provide you answers on this. So again, I think that that most of the attendees in this webinar are familiar with EPC. So the onboarding process is really mostly about the customization of the content. So it means a lot of it is plug and play. But let's say we have, when you look at the full package, it's for example more than 100 business rules. It's a huge set of controls. It's like many processes, and obviously key is to make sure that this somehow fits into the operation in your operational reality or the operational reality of your customers. So really to adapt that and implement that is the key, let's say, the key activity of this onboarding process. We have also in our package, we have a comprehensive set of tools to manage that onboarding, meaning checklists and analysis tools which facilitate this process. So but the situation obviously with each client is different. So if you want to learn, let's say, if you want to have a discussion about this, just get back to us after this webinar. However, I think that Thomas can also contribute to that question. So Thomas, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mirko. Yes, and I guess it's important to say that for those who have already done GDPR compliance work, it is our goal to build on as much as possible of your previous work in order to avoid duplication of efforts. But what we could typically do is we could assist you with the entire life cycle of GDPR compliance. We would take a look at the processes that you have already documented in your organization or that you would like to operationalize. You know, the way you explain to us how you're going to go about with things if they're not documented. And we could help you establishing and drafting the required policies that need to go along with the processes. GDPR is pretty much all about documentation. You know, if the authority representatives are knocking at your doors, they don't want to see a blank sheet of paper. They want you to have a comprehensive documentation of your compliance efforts, and that's what we can do together with you. And we will make sure that you get a perfect digital twin of your GDPR compliance, which can be supported and which will be supported by the EPC, so that you can exactly mirror your processes in the EPC with your real life operations.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and Mirko for that answer. Listen, we're running a little short, so I think we have time for one more question. Here it says, we are a rather small organization, so do we have to hire a DPO manager to be compliant? I'll pass that over to whoever wants to take that question.
Yeah, I can answer that. There's the requirement to have a DPO in place does not apply to all companies. So you do not have to assign a DPO legally and have one in place that is registered as a DPO for the company. However, it is very important to have someone in the company who has the overall responsibility for GDPR compliance, independent of the size of the company. So if you do not want to appoint an official DPO, you will still have to appoint someone who takes the responsibility as whatever you want to name the role. He is acting on a data protection coordinator or what have you. But it's very important to assign this because for accountability and documentation, you have to have clear roles inside the company as well, even if you do not have to appoint a DPO.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jan. Listen, I guess we are running a little bit of time, so I think we will end here. Once again, I want to thank Thomas, Jan, and Mirko for your excellent presentations. It was very interesting. And I'd like to mention that while Interfacing offers like a digital twin application that covers like the full spectrum of process improvement and analysis, governance, and as you see, automation capabilities, specifically for this GDPR compliance solution, which you heard has its own set of like challenges and specific requirements, we have teamed up with Rickert, the leading expert in data protection law, to provide the overall guidance and how-to on implementing a GDPR framework. So this collaboration between our organizations will enable your companies to immediately implement GDPR process governance and structures, and therefore gain the control over the whole operational implementation and most importantly, monitoring the GDPR requirements. So thank you for attending, and immediately after this webinar, you'll receive information on our GDPR advisory services. You'll have also our contact information, so I urge you to reach out to us to begin a conversation on how we can help you fast track your GDPR compliance efforts. So once again, thank you for attending the webinar. Have a good morning, good evening, good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.